Okay, so welcome everybody to week 4 of CIS 126. And again, if you're joining me tonight, special welcome. If you're watching the recording, I'm excited that you're watching it. This week we are going to be looking at arrays. So it's a little bit more of a difficult week, but it's not going to be too complicated. I hope everybody had a good break. I actually missed our session last week. I know we needed the time off, but it's good to be back and good to see everybody. So we are going to get started talking about just some housekeeping as we do every week. So a few quick takeaways from week 3. Coming into this week, obviously we're in week 4, so we don't have too much long left in the class. So week 4 probably is the hardest material that we'll cover in the entire class, talking about arrays. So I encourage you to start early. Make sure that you are getting into the videos. We have a lot of good video resources through the Plural site if you haven't signed up for that. And make sure that you're reading the textbook. Obviously, you're watching this video. In the discussion for this week, I'll also post some information as well. So again, just make sure that you're taking advantage of all of the resources, especially keeping in mind the topic that we're looking at this week. In the assignment section of the classroom, again, I just encourage you to see what is required. And if you miss something, again, we can go back and fix it, not a big deal, but in the assignment section, it is going to tell you, for example, for this assignment, we need a code, a flowchart, and a snippet, or if a flowchart's not required. So just make sure that you're verifying that before you submit your homework. And just a quick reminder for your C files, make sure that you are including some level of comments. It doesn't have to be too in-depth. But remember, the comments are your opportunity to explain what the code is doing, so it's good to include those. And then, of course, our discussion for this week, the main post is due by Thursday, July 11th before 11:59. And anybody that posts after that will be assessed the late penalty. So just a quick reminder about that. Okay, so let's get into the material for this week, arrays. So arrays, if you have already started to look at the material, or if this is the first time that you're hearing it, arrays, in essence, are not too hard, but sometimes how we have to design them and call them can become a little bit complicated. Arrays are considered to be data structures, and they are used typically to store the same type of information under one name. So in our previous weeks, what we've seen is that we will call multiple variables, but we have to call each individual variable. So if we have 5 variables, but they're all of the same type, we have to individually list those. With an array, the benefit of it is that you can combine them into one structure. So you're going to save yourself a little bit of time. Again, the data must be of the same type. And just a quick example, if, for example, we're looking at a classroom and we're trying to capture all of the grades for that class, because all of those grades are going to be of the same data type, probably an integer or a float, we can define it as an array and list all of that information in one structure versus individually calling those variables. So again, if you're thinking about a structure of 50 students in a class, that's going to save you a whole lot of time versus individually calling them. So that's one of the benefits. Some examples of arrays that you probably have seen and maybe not even realized that the software is probably calling it as an array. Our phone contacts in our telephones, in our cell phones, the software actually saves the information, your contacts, within an array, and the phone is then going to sort it and arrange them, however, typically alphabetically. And then, for example, if you've ever looked at a leaders board in any games, any competition, same thing, that information is actually going to be stored in an array because it's the same type of information, and they will be sorted accordingly. Again, in this part, probably descending, but that's just examples of real world situations that we probably have come across and may not even realize that they were actually being stored as an array. So what to expect this week, we are going to learn how to define, initialize, and then how to use arrays. We'll use them to store, sort, and search lists of tables of values of information. And then, of course, we're going to look at the definition and how we can apply them in our programming. Some benefits that we spoke about, again, it's better and it's a more convenient way of storing your data as long as they're the same data type with the same size. And then it's going to allow us to store a known number of elements within it. So Are there limitations with arrays? Sure. But remember, the one thing that we always remind students of is, as you become a programmer and work in the field, we have to provide you with tools so that you then, as you program, decide, will an array be the best way to write this program? Just like we've spoken before, as a mechanic, the mechanic will have an entire toolbox of tools. They then have to decide which is going to be the most applicable. But the more tools we have, we can be more proficient and effective programmers. And arrays is really a great tool to be able to use. So let's look at a few quick examples, and then as promised, we're going to actually get into a programming environment. We'll actually write a code, and then we're also going to look at Flogorithm as well. But this is a very, very simple example of what an array is going to look like. So as we've seen in the past, on line 1, we're going to include our header. Line 3, we have the int main, so nothing new to that. Line 5 is where we are defining or declaring the array. So it bears a lot of similarities to what we've seen in terms of variable declaration. It has to have a type and it has to have a name. In this case, we've defined it as an integer. Why? Because we are defining them as numbers. So again, that has to correlate just like we've seen before. The name of the array in this case is dog. Remember, you can name your array anything, just like you can name your variable anything. The defining thing for the array are those square brackets. In the square brackets, we've listed number 4. What that tells us is that the size of the array, the number of values that the array is going to be able to store, is 4. Now, to the right of that, we are including what those specific values are going to be. That's not always how you will write the array. Sometimes you won't know what numbers will be there. Sometimes you will write them as assigned statements later on. So this is just one example. But then to the right, again, we have our curly brackets, and we have predefined what those 4 values are going to be. In this case, then, we have a for statement. So we have int I equals 0, I is less than 4. So what does that tell us is that we are going to start our counter at 0. We're actually going to end it at 3, because with programming, and you'll see this in Flogorithm and then in your programming language as well, your arrays are going to start, for most programming languages, they're actually going to start at 0. That's predefined by the program, so that's not something we necessarily are going to alter, but we're going to start at the 0 and then go however many numbers we need to capture. Again, in this case, we have 4. The printf statement is simply then going to capture or print off the information. Now, if you look at line 9 is really important, because the printf is going to print out those 4 numbers for us. However, the critical thing is after that comma. After that comma, we are combining our array with our counter. Because remember, what we're trying to tell the program is that we have 4 numbers. In this case, they're predefined as 0, 1, 2, 3. We need the program to count those off before. So week 4 is really, it's a culmination of so many things that we've already learned. We've learned about variables, the types of variables that we can use, the counter, and now we're combining those into one entire program. And then, of course, below, you see what the output should look like, which is just 0, 1, 2, 3. So I'm going to stop here just for a quick second. And again, I know it's a new concept, and I know many of you have already started to work on the assignments, but based on this assignment, what questions do you have, if any? Like I say, we're going to see a few more examples, and then I'm also going to get into the programming environment just to actually walk you through how to program them. And Flogorithm for this is a little bit challenging as well, so we'll look at Flogorithm as well. But what questions, any at this point, do we have about arrays? And again, if you can't talk, you can also chat as well.
I have a question, but
yes,
maybe later on.
Okay. Perfect. Yeah. If they're assignment specific, we can take a look at them at the end. That's no problem. Okay. Robert and Chris, you're both good?
I'm good.
Okay, so let's look at another quick example. So this is, again, pretty similar to what we've seen in the previous one, just trying to reinforce the idea. So very similar, we have our include studio, we have int main. Line 5, again, is where we are now declaring this array. We've defined it again as an integer, whole numbers. The name of the array in this case is array values. We are again assigning it to be the size of 4 because we have 4 numbers that we're planning to print out. Those numbers are 10, 20, 30, 40. Our for statement is going to be, again, starting at 0. We're going to go up to the number 3, or in this case, less than 4. And then we're simply going to print out the results that are predefined based on our array. So we have array values and then count. And again, that's our critical line where we're trying to combine the array with the counter. Now let's look at how this is going to take place in Flowgorithm. Again, this I believe is a little bit more challenging because defining the arrays, and then in this case we have assigned values, which we'll take a look at in just a few minutes. We'll actually get into Flowgorithm and see how that works. But just as we've seen before, we're going to define a variable. Now in this case, there's a little checkbox at the bottom. We have to check that to tell Flowgorithm that it's going to be an array, and then it's going to ask us what the size is. So again, we'll take a look at that. But this is how the array declaration is going to look versus a regular variable. In this case, because we are trying to print out those 4 numbers, 10, 20, 30, 40, we're actually going to do assign statements. So we're going to have 4 assign statements. It's very important, again, that we tell the program that it's array values, because that is our array. That's how we've defined it. These brackets, again, have to be included because we have to tell the program there has to be this level of consistency again. In our declaration, we told the program we were going to have 4 assigned statements, or 4 values assigned to the array. So in the assigned statements, we have to include those square brackets as well. So we're going to say 0, 1, 2, 3 to match our declaration. And then we're simply going to tell the program what numbers specifically it should expect. We also have to define, as we've done in previous weeks, a variable for the count, and then again we're simply going to do an output. So we'll see this in action, but I just wanted you to have a chance to actually see what it was going to look like in the Flowgorithm program. So again, a few tips and suggestions. Tomorrow in the afternoon at noon, I will host just an open office hour, so you're more than welcome to join in for that. Study groups I have tomorrow night from 7 until 8, and then Sunday afternoon from 3:30 to 4:30. So again, the study groups are a great way to jump in, ask questions, see what other questions students have. Sometimes that's a great way to learn as well. But again, just plenty of opportunity for you to jump in and, you know, ask questions or get help that you may need. Okay, so based on what we've seen so far, any questions, or can we go into our programs and then we'll actually start practicing and playing around with how these are going to look in a live situation? I'm going to stop sharing.
Hi, Ms. Sahani.
Hi, Robert. How are you doing?
Hey, good. How are you?
Doing great. It's good to see you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, you too. I was logging on today to find out how to load arrays into Flowgorithm, and I think you went over that just now. But I'm at work and I'm trying to get this information real quick while it's available.
Perfect. Yeah. Let's do that part first, Robert. I'm actually going to pull up Flowgorithm and I'll share my screen with you. And I'll walk you through how to do that specifically. Because like I say, for me, when I first started working with Flowgorithm, that is very challenging. It's almost a little bit more challenging than the programming environment itself. So let me share my Flowgorithm screen and let me know when you can see it.
I can.
Okay. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to base it on one of the programs that we just saw in the PowerPoint, just that way it's a little bit more familiar. And then also those watching can relate to that one as well. So again, we're going to go through pretty much the same process that we've been seeing in the past, but there are going to be slight alterations, right? So we're going to right click on the down arrow, and we're going to start with our, again, you can start with whichever variable you want. I'm going to start with the array. So I'm going to call my array values. This little box, if you can see this little checkbox for array, you have to check that box in order to tell the Flogarhythm program, this is not a regular integer variable, this is an array. So it's going to handle the situation differently. Now, once you've checked that, it's going to ask you for the array size. So again, we're going to just do a very simple size 4 because we have those 4 values that we're going to input and then process in the program. The next variable I'm going to include is my counter for the for statement. So I'm just going to call it count. Now, this is not going to be an array, so I'm just going to leave it as a regular integer, just like we've seen in the past. Now, in this case, again, in Dev++, it's going to be slightly different, and we'll handle that when we get to that program. But in Flogarhythm, again, we have told the program that we have a size of an array of 4. At this point, we have to tell the program, because remember, in this case, we're not asking the user for any information. We're simply outputting the information. Because we already know what it's going to be, we're going to do assign statements. So we're going to do assign. Now let's look at what the assign needs to look like, because it has to match my array. So the variable name is going to be array values. Now remember what I said though, if I just put array values and I don't put those square brackets afterwards, the program is going to become confused, because in the way that I declared the variable, I declared it as an array. If I exclude the square brackets in the assign, now there's a disconnect, because in one instance it's an array and in the other it's not. So the program will give you an error. So to avoid that, we do our square brackets, and inside we're going to do 0. We have to start at 0 because, again, that's where most programs have that predefined. We don't really get to decide that. The expression, we're just going to put the information, in this case, that we know is the value, which is going to start at 10. Now I'm going to copy mine. I like to recycle my stuff. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to click OK. And I'm going to do this 3 more times for my 10, for my 20, my 30, my 40. So let's do another assign. I'm going to paste it. Now it can't stay at 0. It has to go to the next increment, which is going to be 1. The next value was 20. We're going to do 2 more. Same thing, I'm going to paste it. This is going to be number 2. My expression will be 30. And again, this is just based off of the example that we saw. And the last one is going to be 3, and the number is going to be 40. So at this point, we've defined our variables. We've also told the program you have 4 arrays or 4 array values that you're going to output, and these are the values that you're going to have. And again, in the examples that we'll see in the classroom, they may vary slightly, but in general, it's the same concepts that will be applied.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I gotta go. Thank you for answering that.
You're welcome. You're welcome, Robert. It was good to see you.
Thanks.
Take
Bye.
care. Bye-bye. Okay, so once we have the assigned values, now we're going to do our for statement. And remember, what we're trying to do at this point is simply print off those values that we have included. So the for statement will be exactly what we've seen before. So we'll open it up. The variable for the for is going to be count. We're going to do the start value again of 0. And the end value is going to be 3, because we have those 4 numbers that are going to be counted off for us. We'll leave it as increasing, and we'll increment by 1. And then on the next side, the only thing we need to do here is the output. So we'll do an output statement. And again, the only thing I'm trying to do at this point is I'm not giving the user a statement, I'm just outputting those numbers. So again, we've seen this before. We're going to do array values. And again, we have to do that connection between our variable count, which is going to be the for statement, and then our array. So we have to do that combination. And then once we run it, we should get the output of 10, 20, 30, 40. So again, the Flogarhythm is a little bit finicky in terms of how to set up the arrays. But once we see that a few times, it's really going to be very similar each time we create a logarithm for the arrays. So I'll leave that up just for a second. And then at this point, Chris, Leah, do either one of you have any questions as far as the flow charts, anything like that?
No, I do not.
Okay, perfect. Chris, you're good?
I think so for right now.
Okay. And again, you know, we'll have plenty of opportunity through the week. If anybody does have questions, we can either do one-on-ones or you can come to the study group. But this hopefully is a really good introduction in terms of how to set up your logarithm. We'll change gears now and we'll get into the programming environment so that we can see how that is going to now equate into an actual program. And let me know when you can see my screen.
Okay.
Okay, perfect. So, hi Lily, how are you doing?
Hi.
How's everything going?
Pretty good.
Good. I'm glad you're here, Lily. We are looking at tonight arrays. And right now we went through the flowchart. Now we're just going to convert that into a program. So stick around and, you know, at the end we'll also have time to ask questions as well if there's something more specific you want us to look at.
Okay.
Okay, so we're going to start just like we've started before. If I can type. After a week of not doing much, I'm getting rusty. Okay, so again, same thing that we've seen before, nothing too crazy. So in the initial logarithm that we had, the very first thing we did was to define the array. So we're going to interpret that now into our programming environment, just as we've seen in previous weeks. Slightly different to what we've seen, but again, the type of the variable and the name stays true, whether it's a regular variable or an array. So we'll do array values. Remember, we had to tell the program how many spaces we were going to assign to the array. And then we were going to tell it the specific numbers to look for. So that's how we would define our array. Once I've written the program this way, I'm going to come back around and show you another way that you can do the assign that's going to almost mirror a lot closer to the logarithm. Either one is acceptable, but I'll show you both ways. But again, int array values, so it's the type of the variable, the name of the variable. Remember, those square brackets indicate that you are dealing with an array. To the right of the equation, we have our curly brackets and then the specific values that are going to be assigned to the array. We then had our counter, which I'm actually not going to define it as the counter. I'm going to do that in my for statement. So we said for int counter equals 0. Because remember, according to our flow chart, we needed to start our value at our 0. Then we're going to say counter is less than 4. And then we're going to go counter plus plus. Now we just need to do our printf statement. So we're going to do printf for this one, we are only printing off the variable. So again, in our case, the variable is an integer. We've seen this before. In order to represent an integer within the printf statement, we're going to do %d. Because we wanted that line space between the numbers, so one number on the next line, the next number on the next line, the next number, I'm going to do our \n. This is where now I have to assign the variables in order for it to print. And remember, in our flowchart, what we saw was that it was a combination. We needed to combine those two variables to recognize the array numbers and then also to count those numbers off for us. So we had array values, square bracket to indicate that we are dealing with an array, and then count. Then we're going to do a semicolon, curly bracket, and then we're going to have return 0 and then semicolon. Let's see what happens. Hopefully there won't be any errors. There is an error. Let's see. Oh, counter, that's why. There we go. And so again, we see, just as we saw in the Flogorithm, that we have this printout now of 10, 20, 30, 40. Now I'm going to change this up just a little bit, because you'll see arrays written in this way as well. So in the Flogorithm, we defined our variable as int array values. We assigned it the number 4. And then what we did is we did assign statements for each of those specific values. You can do that same thing in your Dev++. You don't have to do it the way that I just did it. You can assign them here as well. And what that's going to look like is array values, just like we did, square bracket. Inside, we're going to do 0. And then we're going to say equals 10. And we'll do that for all 4 numbers. So we'll do, just like we did in Flogorithm, we'll do array values 1 equals 20. Array values 2 equals 30. And then array values 4 equals 40. So sometimes you'll see them interchanged. You'll see them written on one line. Sometimes you'll see them written on the next line. This obviously seems a little bit more work because you have to do it every time. If you copy and paste like I did, it's not going to take you too much longer. But remember, the larger your arrays, it may be easier just to include them on one line. But just so that you see how they can be written differently, that is another way that you can look at it as well. So that really is how we are going to approach the homework for this week. Like I say, the programs that we'll look at may be slightly a little bit more challenging, but again, we're going to go through the flow chart and then create our Flogorithm with the arrays as we saw, and then we're going to come over into Dev++ and now convert that into a program as well. So what questions on what we've seen so far, and then again, we'll switch gears to the assignments for this week and kind of see what those are going to look like, and we'll take a look in the classroom. But so far, what we've seen, Leah and Lily, any questions on these assignments? Do they help a little bit to make sense of what we're going to be looking at for this week?
Yes, that made sense.
Perfect.
Yeah, this definitely helps. It makes it a lot less confusing.
Good. Yeah, like I say, arrays, once you get the hang of it, you're going to see the great value of them, but it's just initially when you see them. In my opinion, it's the hardest thing that we've looked at so far in the class. But again, if you can get those strong foundational concepts down, you'll see that the assignments, again, they'll have their little nuances, but it will start to make a little bit more sense. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm going to get into the class just for a second. I just want to see exactly what we're going to be looking at for this week. And then, like I say, we can go into specific questions that either one of you have. Okay, so let's take a look at one of the guided practices. Let's look at guided practice number 2. Now again, the guided practice is obviously, for the most part, there may be a typo in this one. I can't remember, but if we have issues, we'll address those. But again, for the guided practices, the whole purpose of them is for us to be exposed to the code, to see what it's going to look like, how it behaves. So again, if we scroll down, as I mentioned at the beginning of the session, let's look at, first of all, what is required for the assignment. So I always come down to the submission instructions. And it says, firstly, enter the code above, run it. And for this one, there's no flow chart. So again, if you wanted to work on the flow chart just to get some experience, you're more than welcome to. And if you want to submit it, that's great. It's not required though, but I say the more exposure you can get, the more practice you can get both in the Flogorithm program and in Dev++. It's just going to serve you, especially as we get into week 5. But as far as submissions go for the Unit 4 Guided Practice 2, it's not required. There's no flowchart. So just the code and then the output. So let's take just a quick look at the assignment just to kind of familiarize ourselves with what is going on based on what we've seen. So if we look at the beginning, we see, first of all, it's kind of a combination of things, right? We have our void print scores, float scores. So that's going to be our function that we've seen from the previous weeks. We then come into our main program. So let's look at what the main program is doing. Line 7, there's a few things going on. Line 7 is an array. Why? Based on those square brackets, right? Remember, always correlate your square brackets with arrays. We have a character. So now that's the variable type. We're going to be dealing with a character or words versus numbers, so not integers. The name of the variable is sname, and we have assigned the value of ECPI University. So that's what we're expecting to print out. We then have a second array on line 8. It's a numerical one. It's a float because we have decimals, and we're expecting 6 numbers. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then we have just the average and the counter. So we are going to ask, what is the class average? And then we're going to print out those scores to the screen for the user. So let's see what the output's going to look like. So it tells us, here are your scores, and it lists those 6 scores that we had provided in the array on line 8. And then it also tells us, at ECPI University, your class average is 93.7. And again, that's coming from this line right here, which is line 18. So this program really is a very, very good combination of many of the things that we've looked at before. We're looking at our functions, we're looking at variable declarations, and within the program, we have several different types of variables. We have our array, which we saw in the example that we covered earlier, where we have a predefined size, 6. In this case, ours was 4. In this case, it's going to be the scores for the students at the university. We're going to print those out to the screen. We then, on top of that, have a calculation in order to determine what the average of those scores is, and then we're going to print that out as well. So kind of, again, bringing all of these tools as a mechanic just would do the same thing. We're bringing all of those different resources now into one program, combining them into one, and now having this kind of output. And then let's take a look at the next one just to see what that's going to look like. And then, like I say, we'll have a chance at that point. I'll stop recording, and then we'll have a chance just to chat about any questions that you two have. Okay, and this is going to be, this assignment is really nice. I like this next assignment. And this is one that we saw this, as I was going through the example. Again, this is going to now illustrate that second way of how to write programs. So remember, in the example that I showed, we had 4 numbers. And the first way that I wrote it, I said array values equals, and then in the curly brackets, I listed the specific numbers on one line. Then we changed things up. I went back into the program, and then I listed them as assigned statements, just like we saw in Flowgorithm. So this program is now mirroring the second option, which is how we, instead of putting all the temperatures on one line, now we're going to do assigned statements. And again, either version is not wrong. It's just going to come down to most times personal preference. Again, in this way, does it take a little bit longer to write? Not necessarily, because again, you can do the copy and paste, but now each specific temperature has its own declaration or its own assigned statement. So in this program, we are looking at temperatures. They are obviously going to be decimals, so they're going to be a float. We are predefining what the temperatures are going to be. So remember, the array, and I believe one of the graded exercises now does the opposite. You don't tell the user what the temperatures are going to be. You ask the users what it's going to be. And that's something that we do have to think about as we program. is this something that we need to give the user, or do we need to ask the user for their input? Because a lot of times programs are asking for information, so we have to think about that as we're writing our programs. In this case, we have predefined temperatures. We then have a printf statement where we're going to say the daily temperatures for the last X number of days, and then we're going to print out those temperatures, and the output is going to look as such. So again, combining that array, as we have seen in the example that I covered at the beginning of the session, with our counter to be able to print out the applicable information. So based on these two examples and the work that we've looked at, what questions do we have? And then, like I say, once I've gone through any of those, we'll stop recording and then we can talk about maybe specific questions that anybody has for the assignments. But just in terms of arrays, maybe understanding them or how to write them, is it starting to make a little bit more sense? Maybe going through some of the examples helps a little bit, hopefully.
The first example, which is the guided practice number 2, I tried to do that earlier today and I kept getting an error on
the output. Okay, so let's do this. I thank everybody for coming, and hopefully, again, if you're watching, this has been helpful. I encourage everybody to either set up one-on-one times with me or come to the study groups. But again, this is just, it's a great week. The arrays are such a useful tool. So hopefully this has been helpful. And again, welcome back from the break, and I'm looking forward to a great week.